Greetings! In this video I'll be painting up a Centurion for my Ultramarines Legion. I figured it might be something worth recording as a March for Macragge video, but also because he's a fancy dude who I want to get looking fairly nice. So there might be some bits in here that you'll find useful for whatever you're painting up. As for the mini itself, it's a standard Centurion model from the 3rd edition launch box with no alterations. I prime my Ultramarines black, then undercoat them with Macragge blue through my airbrush. I used to use a spray can, but the cost, the inability to ship it, and the requirement for good weather made me switch over. With the airbrush I also get much smoother results, no matter the weather, but preventing clogs and cleaning the airbrush can be a hassle. Anyway, my first step after the airbrush was to make sure that the blue armour was fully painted in, using Macragge blue. Complex models like this one can be hard to spray with all the overlapping bits, so this just helps unify the undercoat. After the blue was done, I switched over to Mephiston red and began painting in the cloak. I started by painting red on the outside of the cloak, but I changed my mind and switched so that the red would be on the inside instead. This meant that the little 3D trim part is also going to be red. I figured the cloak was going to be a hassle with how it's positioned, so starting now allowed for cleanup time later. Next, for the other side of the cloak, I used Ulthorn grey to paint that bit in, doing a few thin coats to get nice coverage over the dark undercoat. I also painted in the visible stripe bit on his faceplate, like the 3rd edition reference shows, and painted in the entire crest in preparation for segmenting it later. With such a complicated model, I was apprehensive about making any major step, so I painted the haft of the power maul at this stage, using Screamer Pink as the base coat and Pink Horror as an edge highlight. This bit is fairly out of the way, so doing it now helped me frame the rest of it in my mind. I switched over to Abaddon black to paint in the weapon casing, any visible undersuit bits, and the large middle section of the destroyed rapier weapons carrier he's standing on, as well as segmenting the helmet crest, similar to the reference shown. With so many metal details and trim all over the model, I decided that now was the time to tackle them. I started with gunmetal grey to base coat all of the silver bits. This included the combi melter, the chains, both the mail hanging from the waist and the chains that connect the falloray, the disc bits, and the numerous other bits around the model, such as the power pack, helmet details, and those cables on the legs. Onto the gold now, using Retributor armour. This took quite some time. There's a heap of trim and embellishments that I wanted gold. I painted more areas than even the reference showed, so yeah, I wanted this guy to look as obviously high ranking as possible. Now for the leather, starting with Rhinox hide as a base coat. There's a belt hidden either side of the large buckle as well as the combi melter sling to paint. The first highlight was done with Scrag brown, applied along the edges and doing some scratching effects like I usually do. A final highlight was done with Deathclaw brown, applied over smaller areas to attempt to emphasise and brighten the look. Now for the cloth and bone on the banner. I used Zandri dust to base coat these, doing a few coats. A first highlight was done with the Ushabti bone, covering most of the surface but leaving the recessed areas as the previous tone. Finally, I used Screaming Skull, both along the edges and the flat surfaces, painting little lines to add texture. The skulls had a similar approach, but apply with little dots instead. Next I turned my attention to the blue armour, deciding to try for a middle ground highlight between my usual mix of Macragge blue and Cowguard blue, this time using Altdorf guard blue. This was applied on the upwards facing surfaces and along edges to increase the overall brightness. I tried to have some sort of transition between the two tones, but I'm not too good at that, so I didn't really focus on it. Now onto the markings. I started with a gloss varnish to prepare various surfaces for decals. Once the varnish was dry, I applied a bunch of decals, cutting around the edges of some of them like the ones on the pauldrons, so they looked like they were partially hidden by the cloak. I was planning to use a large blue Ultima transfer on the rear of the cloak, but the prospect of trying to get it to sit just right and wrap around the cloak made me reconsider. I instead used a pencil to draw a rough outline of the shape. Then I started painting it in with Macragge blue. It's a little rough, but after I was done with this pass, I went back in with Ulthorn grey to clean up. I then switched back to Altdorf guard blue to highlight the Ultima glyph in the same way I did the armour earlier. The rest of the white cloak needed some attention now too, so I got some Corax white and applied it over the raised bits of the cloak. As I was planning to do a wash at the end, I directed the highlights towards the raised areas, avoiding areas where the wash would pool. Next I used some warpstone glow to paint the little wreath on the banner. I've noticed this paint takes a few coats to cover. To highlight the green, I used moot green, painting the edges by lightly brushing over the top. This way I can edge highlight without having to go at every single edge individually. Sticking with greens for now, I used some Lupercal green to base coat the rest of the destroyed rapier weapons carrier, leaving the wheels for later. I then used some Sons of Horus green to apply some highlights, sticking to the edges at the start but pushing in and doing some scratches all over it. It's destroyed after all. I then went back to gunmetal grey to paint in the wheels and the track bits on the rapier, as well as fix some silver bits on the Centurion that I noticed lacked full coverage. Now moving back to the red, I used some Evil Sun Scarlet to highlight the islands, as well as going over most of the visible red areas on the cloak. This both cleaned up some bits where the white had gone over into the red, as well as helping to brighten up the red to match how bright the white is. I also painted in the gem bits on his greaves and on the banner. To highlight the gems and the islands, I started with Wild Rider red, painting in a portion of the area to act as the main area of the glow. I then followed with Lugganath orange, to paint in the source of the glow, or for the gems where the lightest reflection bit is. Going back to the base yet again, I switched over to Eshin Grey to highlight the black bits there, as well as any black bits on the Centurion itself, such as the weapon casing or the black bits on his crest. Next I highlighted the silver parts, using Runefang steel. This is basically just to emphasise the high points on the silver bits, whilst also painting in all the rivets around the model. I briefly switched back to Retributor armour to clean up the gold, like bits where I went over with a different colour or where I didn't fully base coat it. Then I hit the wrong button and recorded the before and after parts where I applied washes. These were Seraphim Sepia all over the gold, and Drutii Violet over the tip of the muzzle, transitioning into Seraphim Sepia, doing a wet gradient. Next, to finish the basing for now, I used Steel Legion Drab to base coat the dirt bits, and then Baneblade brown to highlight them. We're nearing the end now. I decided to use some Aethermatic blue contrast paint to act as a subtle glow effect in lieu of actually painting like energy effects. I figured it'd be too busy had I done that. Now for the final highlight of the armour, using Calgar blue. An edge highlight with little scratches here and there was applied everywhere I could find space. Using the previously applied scratches as a base, I used Rhinox hide to add some deeper chipping effects, simulating where the outer coating of the paint has been torn off and showing the in-universe primer underneath. Now finally onto the enamel wash, using AK Interactive's Sepia Paneliner. I applied this fairly heavily all over the model, even over the white cloak. I knew that I could clean it up anywhere I wasn't happy, so I just went for it. I used some enamel thinners on a cotton tip to clean up the cloak a bit, as it was definitely too dirty and needed some cleanup. After the enamel was fully dry, I applied my usual basing method, painted the base rim black, and then sealed everything in with some Ultramatte varnish. And here we have it, a Centurion from the Ultramarines Legion. This guy was a huge undertaking to paint and record. I tried to go for the standard that I typically do for my own minis, and the recording ended up being almost 8 hours of footage, and most of that was base coating the cloak and the gold trim, but a fair bit was highlighting the blue and silver, so yeah. Obviously I've cut down a heap and tried to keep it somewhat followable, but it's definitely a difficult model to record, especially with how I went about doing it. All that said, I'm very happy with the outcome. The banner's fairly nice, and the large amount of gold trim is really fitting. I'm super pleased with the Ultima glyph on the cloak. It's the first time I've done such a large design like that, beyond a very rough attempt at a company banner I did a few years ago, but I'm still very happy with how clean this one came out. This guy will serve well in my Legion, which I'll show off for my 100th video, similar to how I showed off my Ultramarines chapter for my 50th video. I do hope you found something in this video useful. I know the Ultramarines aren't to everyone's tastes, but I'm happy I tried a more fancy model like this for the channel. It has put me a fair bit behind, but I'll find some time to catch up. But anyway, next week's video will be back to requested chapters and the like. Hope you stick around for that one.